Welcome to Voices in Social Work, a Carleton School of Social Work podcast. We discuss important topics in the field of social work and give you the tools to start some new conversations with those around you. We acknowledge that Carleton is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation and are exploring ways to support Indigenous communities who have suffered in order for us to be here and do what we do. Let's get started. Hi, and welcome back to Voices in Social Work. Before the episode is introduced, I wanted to take a minute to acknowledge that this episode is being released during a time where there has been a lot of violence, death, and displacement due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I also wanted to note that there are many other areas of the world with armed conflicts and crisis situations. The Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, or ACLED, highlights Ethiopia, Yemen, the Sahel region of Africa, Nigeria, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Sudan, Haiti, Colombia, and Myanmar as areas of conflict that are likely to worsen in 2022. I have a lot more to learn about what is happening in these areas, but I'll just say that my thoughts and prayers go out to everybody in situations that I can't even imagine. One suggestion I have is that if you are looking to donate to any humanitarian efforts, consult charity evaluation sites such as Charity Intelligence Canada to ensure that your money will be used well. Thank you, and we'll now move on to the podcast episode. Hi everyone, welcome to episode 7 of the Voices in Social Work podcast. This is actually going to be the last episode for a little while. I'm not going to be releasing any episodes during the spring semester, and then in the fall I'm not quite sure what's going to happen. It kind of depends on a few different things working out. One of those things would be the results of the evaluation that's going to be released with this episode. It will be linked in the description, so if you could complete it, that would be really helpful. Thanks in advance. It asks a few questions about what you thought about the podcast and what kind of format you would like to see in the future. In the meantime, since this is the last episode, I decided that it might be fun to look back on what I've learned from all of the podcast episodes so far. I realized that while I remember learning a lot from each conversation when I was in it, now that it's in the past, I don't remember a lot. I've forgotten a lot of what I've learned for sure. So I figured it would be a good opportunity for me to make myself go back and reflect on the previous episodes. Plus, these episodes were super dense. There was a lot of information packed into a short amount of time. So I actually ended up learning things the second or third time around and noticing things that I hadn't noticed in my first listen. For people who have listened to the episodes, I thought this might be interesting for you to hear what I took, just a different perspective from your own, and maybe it will help you think more about what you've learned, or even just encourage you to go back, re-listen, and pay attention to something different now that you've had somebody else's take on it as well. If you haven't listened to the episodes, you can treat this as kind of a teaser to see if you'd be interested in listening to the full episode. All right, let's just jump right into it. So I'll start with episode 2 of the podcast, which is titled Tokenism in the Workplace and Growing Up Asian Canadian. My guest Emmy and I shared our experiences of being third or fourth generation Asian Canadian, and then talked about what it means to be the token minority in a workplace, and how members of both the minority group and the dominant group can respond. When we were recording the episode, I definitely noticed that Emmy and I kind of talk and think at different paces, so that means there were a lot of really cool insights of hers that I missed when we were talking, and that's also partly because I was a little nervous and I was trying to make sure we were on pace and that the conversation was going where we had planned it to go. So then I remember going back and listening to the episode again in the edit and being so surprised at how much more I appreciated her perspective and the ideas she was bringing forward. To me, I think that conversation was really special because I've never really been able to talk to anybody about the third or fourth generation Asian Canadian experience before, and I think it's also one of the few times that somebody who is Asian has acknowledged my experience or my upbringing as something more than some sort of cultural mistake. So I think for me that was really significant and really encouraging as well. And then when we actually got to the tokenism conversation after a while, Again, I learned more than I thought I was going to learn. Before I researched for the episode, I thought, or my first thought about tokenism was just that it's being asked a bunch of questions where you have to represent your race or another part of your identity, like that it's just about speaking for a bunch of people and not wanting to speak for so many people. And personally, that doesn't really connect with me because I haven't been in situations like that, so I've never really seen tokenism as an important issue. But after reading the research about the 3 pillars of tokenism, which we cover in the episode, it really clarified to me what tokenism is and how it's actually about people expecting you to be a stereotype and then pushing back when you're not, and then also the strengths of your identity not being acknowledged or valued in your workplace. And I think to me that connects with me a lot more. That's much more relatable and also much more of a complicated and important issue to me. At the end of the podcast episode, I also really liked the advice that Emmy was giving and how she provided both kind of larger scale suggestions for managers or people who are at the level to affect the hiring process or the policy process wherever you work, but then also smaller scale suggestions for people who are looking to support their coworkers around them, but don't necessarily have that kind of power. And I really liked the point she made about how it's not about trying so hard to say the right thing or do the right thing, but that it's about putting in the effort and trying to improve a little bit every day and also being okay when you're wrong and accepting that you're wrong, which I think is also a big part of what it means to quote unquote own your privilege, if you've ever heard that saying before. So I think for me, that was a really cool connection that I made as well. Okay, I'm going to move on to the 3rd episode of the podcast, which was called How to Be Authentic in Your Work. My guest was Noah, and we talked about what it means to be true to yourself in your work, how this can be difficult when you're part of a marginalized group, and some advice about how you can help both yourself and the people around you be more authentic at work. So, when Noah and I were planning for this episode, I asked him what kind of message he wanted to send to listeners, and this is one of the main things that he brought up. It was something he really wanted to talk about, and I didn't really realize how significant of a topic it was until after we were done and I was able to reflect a little bit more. And then afterwards, I realized that his message was actually something I would have really wanted to hear while I was a social work student. So I think it was such an amazing choice. I remember being a student and being in class and noticing all the ways that I was different from my classmates and wondering if I had what it took to be a good social worker. And I didn't even know that it was possible for me to be myself and accept all those parts of me that are different and still be a social worker. So I think Noah did a great job with expressing that. One great point I think Noah brought up is the idea of being professional but not hiding behind your professional training so much that you stop trying to make a genuine personal connection with whoever you're talking to. He also did a really great job of making what could have been a really abstract concept of just be yourself, which I think I've heard so many times that it's kind of lost all meaning. But he made it very specific by providing real life examples of therapeutic choices and conversations, and also included times when he actually chose not to be fully authentic because the situation didn't call for it, or so that he could protect his energy or save his energy to get through the day. I think the conversation turned out really great because of those specifics and also the reality of try to be yourself, but it's not going to be possible all the time. And I think I left that conversation feeling pretty confident myself about what it means to be authentic and kind of excited to try it out. Moving on to the 4th episode, it was Letting Social Work's Past Change Our Future, where my guest Lorianne and I talked about acknowledging white supremacy in social work, the reasons why she chose to become a social worker anyways, and how she allows that history to change her work now. I kind of used this episode as a way for me to ask a bunch of questions that I wasn't confident enough to ask in school, I think, where I thought maybe I would look stupid if I asked those questions. So I was excited to do this episode. And for me, that was kind of the reason that I added the disclaimer type statement at the beginning of the conversation, just welcoming people into the conversation about white supremacy, just because I wanted to put my 2 cents into the conversation and say for people that weren't really aware that this was a problem, that it's important to keep moving forward and learning, and you don't need to let any peer pressure or shame from your peers drive you to just give up because it's too hard to understand, or to give up because you think, oh, I'm never going to get this. This is just too far beyond me. And so, yeah, don't let people push you away from that conversation. Okay, now getting into more of what Lorianne and I were talking about. I think one thing that really stuck out to me was how she called social work a messy space, which I think was actually really cool. And I didn't realize how much I liked that term until afterward. And because I think most of the time I only hear people talking about social work as all good or all bad, or they only talk about one at a time and not both at the same time. But yet we have to deal with both at the same time every day. And I think that was a really good lead in to, again, the really specific examples that she gave about therapeutic choices or conversations that she's had or that other people have had, and also even larger scale things like workplace policies at agencies that she's seen. And I think Lori did the same thing as Noah, where she took what could easily have been a very abstract concept with no application, which I think makes it harder sometimes for people in power or people in dominant groups to understand what's happening. But she turned it instead into really concrete steps that I felt like I could wake up tomorrow and take those steps if I wanted to. So I really liked that part. And kind of similar to Noah as well, I guess, I feel like she presented this really cool picture of a social worker who is well trained but doesn't hide behind their training and approach every client in the same way, but who's able to listen and take in cues about whether the approach that you're trying is working or not, and then adjusting. The fifth episode was called When Self-Care Isn't Enough. My guest Namrata and I talked about the idea of community care or collective care, compared it to self-care, and gave some advice for people looking to build more of a community around themselves. Again, this topic was not my suggestion. It was something that Namrata really wanted to talk about. And once we kind of got into it and I started doing research and then we started talking, I realized that it's kind of something that I was learning on my own, a little bit in the back of my head, but something I wasn't really too aware of. So I think this topic is going to resonate with a lot of people because, to me anyway, it's one of those ideas that is kind of forming in the back of your head, but because it's not talked about a lot in society, we don't really think consciously about it until we hear somebody else talk about it. But I think it really rings true because I think a lot of us see there are issues with the way that we talk about self-care in society, and sometimes you think, oh, there's very clear holes in that concept, but you're not really able to put your finger on it. So I think I really liked this conversation because it clarified that for me. Namratha did a really good job as well of connecting really big picture political and sociology concepts to also small scale thoughts and choices that we make every day, which I think shows how politics doesn't have to be this very untouchable subject, but that it's really about our lives and how other people's choices affect our lives every day. I also really liked the part of the podcast where we were discussing some issues that we found with society's definition of self-care. Again, I think because it kind of resonated with things that I was already thinking about. And it was cool for me to learn about how the idea of self-care didn't start like this, how we've kind of turned it into something different from what it originally was. For me, I think self-care is talked about so much, especially in social work, that I don't even really question it anymore when I hear the term. So it was really good to be able to look at it more closely and to figure out what it is and what it isn't. And I also really liked the advice about how to build a community around yourself. I thought that was really relevant. And I liked how there were both practical steps you could take for how to deepen a friendship with someone who you know on a surface level, like maybe there's a little bit of a strategy there, but also we both stressed the need to just do some personal reflection as well, so that you're able to feel scared, but then also choose to put yourself out there anyways. The last episode was number 6, a racialized graduate school experience, where Emem and I were both asking and answering questions to each other, which was a first for me again. We compared our experiences in graduate school as racialized students, and in Emem's case, she also talked about being a new immigrant, and we discussed imposter syndrome, and then also shared some advice about surviving graduate school, and then also about the process of leaving graduate school and entering the workforce. I think this episode kind of reminded me of the one that I did with Emmy because it was a little bit more personal and I was talking about my personal experiences. But at the same time, I also learned a lot of new things and was introduced to a new experience because I don't have any firsthand knowledge of what it's like to come to graduate school as a new immigrant or an international student. In terms of that perspective, I think the main thing that I learned from MM, which also I found in research, was how when you move to a new country, people expect you to know all of these unspoken rules of their society, and they can kind of subtly shame you for not knowing them because they don't realize how hard it can be to adjust to a new culture or how different cultures can be from each other. And I think that's something that I'm definitely going to keep in mind whenever I talk to people that are new to the country. And I think I have a little bit more of an appreciation for how hard it can be to figure out those unspoken rules. So hopefully that changes my behavior a little bit. I also got to rethink my whole concept of imposter syndrome and how maybe I didn't have imposter syndrome in graduate school, and instead that it might have been some sort of reasonable response to the cues that I was getting from my environment. So I thought that was a really cool concept. Once you actually get to grad school, there is a good amount of talk about imposter syndrome, or people mention it a lot. So for me, it was interesting to get to question all of it and to also look at it a little bit more closely. I found a really great article that I share in the podcast that really changed my perspective on imposter syndrome. So go check out the episode if you'd like to learn about it. And again, I'm glad we ended with some practical advice. We both tried to give advice as if we were talking to our younger selves, or we talked about things that we wished we had known when we were students. So hopefully people find that useful if you were in similar situations to us. All right, phew, that's all of the episodes. It was fun actually for me to go through it again, fun after I was done and realized how much I had learned. One thing I also noticed is that there is actually a lot of overlap between the episodes, or sometimes we kind of end up with the same conclusions or talk about really similar things because we were all talking about race and how it affects different aspects of our lives and our work. But I think one really cool thing about that was that because we approached the topic of race in so many different angles, I kind of started to build this picture in my head of the person that I want to be after learning all of these different things. So I'm really grateful for that, and I think that's really exciting. I wanted to say a huge thank you to Emmy, Noah, Lorianne, Namrata, and Emem for putting so much time and effort into our discussions. It really did take a lot of planning, and also I know they worked really hard at trying to say things that were really meaningful to them in the conversation, so thank you so much for that. There are also a lot of people from the Carleton School of Social Work helping out in the background, so I'd really like to thank Dr. Todd, Dr. Cow, and Dr. Farrer for their guidance behind the scenes, and also Andrea, Megan, and Karen, and Jeffrey for all of the administrative help. And also thank you to everybody who has listened to the podcast for any amount of time. Thank you for bearing with me through some sketchy editing and technical issues. It's definitely not my forte, but I've learned a lot. and I hope that you found something that you want to explore further or talk about with somebody else. Again, the feedback form is going to be in the description, so please complete it if you liked anything that you heard from the past semester. I think that's everything I needed to cover in this last episode, so thank you so much for listening. It's been a lot of work and a lot of fun, and we'll see what happens in the future, but I'm really thankful for the episodes that we got to do this semester. So thank you so much, and goodbye. Thank you for listening to Voices in Social Work. We hope you now have something new to talk about or explore. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at sswpodcast@carleton.ca. You can also visit voicesinsocialwork.podbean.com to see our full list of episodes and links to all of the ways you can listen to us. See you next time.